In this video, we're going to learn about the run outline and satin serial outline properties. And to begin, I'm just going to select a new empty workspace and just use my freehand drawing tool to simply draw some kind of a wavy line. And I'm not going to close my shape. In other words, I'm going to right click and allow this to be an open shape. Because remember, open shapes can only have outline properties versus shapes which have been closed, which can have both fill and outline properties. And in this video, I wanted to focus in on specifically the run outline and satin serial outline properties. And of course, the main difference between a run outline and a satin serial is that run outlines are outlines which are going to stitch kind of forward, 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 like the straight stitch on our sewing machine. And of course, we'll be able to apply effects to that, like special stitches. But the opposite being the satin serial, this is where the line is stitched with embroidery stitches that zigzag back and forth to fill that area. And so that is the main difference between your run line and your satin serial. Now, let's look at the properties for a run line, and it allows me to control the outline width. Well, that certainly with satin serial is a much more appropriate thing. With satin serial, this is how you can adjust the width of the satin column. If I make it 3 millimeters, you'll see it become much fatter. If I make it 1 millimeter, much more narrow. But when I go to the running line, that's not as appropriate until we get to the type of stitches. Now notice when I type in the outline width of 1, let's go back to the default, which was 0.4. It puts none. It makes it a single line. But if I tell it it's a run stitch with an outline width of 1 millimeter, it chooses a triple stitch. So the software knows, based upon the outline width, a style of stitching that you can select. But of course, we can always take control of these things, and so by clicking on the triple, I can see all of the options. So there's none, which makes the single run line, double run line, triple run line, or decorative lines like, for example, a chain stitch. And notice now how it's filling in my area with this chain stitch pattern. And now once I've selected the chain stitch, now the outline width becomes the sort of overall size of the chain. So if it's 1 millimeter, if I make it 3, it'll make those, well, that's 1,000. Hold on, let's just type in 3, tab. See how it makes the size of each chain larger? If I choose mirror stitches, it will change the direction with which they point along my line. Offset, well, that's going to be my ability to push this chain stitch to one side or the other side of this line. So if I give a 2 millimeter offset, it'll push it to one side. And if I give a negative 2 millimeter offset, it'll push it to the other side. And in that way, you could have two objects which stitched sort of side by side, or perhaps around a fill. So this is your ability to offset the stitches from your line. The number of passes, well, this is going to affect the number of times that it stitches the elements of your design. And so imagine if you had, for example, a double or a single run line, but you set the number of passes to 2 or 3, then it will travel back and forth along the line the number of times you choose. The length, well, this is going to relate to the distance from one stitch to the next. So if I choose the length and by default it's set at 2.5, but if I check that, I could make that 3 or 4, and that's adjusting the distance from one needle penetration to the next. Now you can take control of the sequence. In other words, I could force this object to be the start of my design or the end of my design, or to stop before a specific object, or I could just leave it at auto, which allows it to be sorted out with the rest of the shapes by the auto sequence control. And finally, we have remove overlaps, which in the case of a run stitch isn't really going to be something that would be effective. It's more for when we have closed shapes with fills and outlines that you may wish to adjust the remove overlaps. But the idea is when you choose remove overlaps, it will affect any objects that are underneath of this object in terms of overlapping stitches. So now that is the outline properties. If I change it to satin serial, the biggest difference is, of course, you need to really control the width. So it's set at 3 millimeters. And I want you to imagine a 3 millimeter satin column Now we have additional settings. So for example, we could give a pattern. A pattern we maybe want it to be wider than 3. What if this was, I don't know, 8 millimeters wide, which is pretty fat, isn't it, for a satin stitch? In which case we could apply a pattern. So all of your different sort of step fill patterns could be applied along a satin serial outline. And so really a satin serial is another way of creating satin stitches, very different from the satin fill, because the satin fill could be any shape. An outline is always a constant width from the center line that we draw. But because I drew in this case, the line that I've drawn, trying to select it, is 8 millimeters wide, now the satin stitch is so long it's appropriate to put a pattern on it. If this was back at 3 millimeters, then probably a pattern's not required, and it may just add too many extra stitches, so we could leave it at none. This is kind of how it works. Handmade corners. Let's do this. Let's zoom out. Let's take a little simple shape like a pie shape. Select that pie shape, and for the outline of the pie shape, let's give it a satin serial. And I'm going to zoom in over top of that shape. If I turn off the handmade, or turn on handmade corners, it changes the way that it stitches around those corners. I'll turn it off. The stitches are turning around the corners. If I turn handmade corners on, it stitches out one corner and then kind of down the other side. So it's just a different way of stitching around the corners, and it's an on-off choice. Offset, again, we can offset our outline to be outside of a shape. So if you, for some reason, wanted some space between the fill and the offset, you could put a 3 millimeter offset and have a space in between the fill and the offset. I'll hit undo. For a satin, when you have a satin serial outline, you get a density setting now. So density is the distance between the rows of stitches, and by taking control of the density, I can make it, for example, 1 millimeter would be a very open spacing, or 0.4 of a millimeter is more of a standard satin fill. We can add compensation to a satin serial, which basically fattens it up. It's by default at 0.1, so if I make it 0.5, you'll see how, well, and it doesn't, you won't see this per se until you see by slow redraw what it's doing, because it's something that gets added when it generates the actual stitches. But what it's going to do is fatten up that satin stitch. It's going to move the stitches out beyond their natural shape by 0.5 a millimeter, or by whatever setting you choose. We also have the ability to control the underlay. And so when we have a satin serial, and let's zoom out a little bit and go back to the first one that I made. So a fairly substantial width to this satin stitch that we've got. It's a 3 millimeter satin stitch. So it probably needs, and by default, it's set at double. If I change this to 1 millimeter, by default, it changed it to single. If I knew that I had a 3 millimeter outline and I wanted more than a double, I could click on here, and now I have the full option of double, or for example, cross, or netting plus. So netting plus is going to give me a double zigzag with a contour or a sort of edge outline. And so that's how you can take control. So with a satin serial, as we change the width, we may want to change the underlay settings. We always have the ability with our objects to control the sequence to the start, to the end, or stop before, as well as to remove overlaps, and that is again how it relates to objects that are sewing underneath this objects, and the settings are never, auto, and always. So that is my video on the outline and satin serial outline properties.